this episode of the Photography News podcast, Roger keeps a promise, Will hunts poppies, and Kingsley reveals how landscape photography nearly killed him. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Photography News podcast. My name is Roger Payne. I'm the editorial director at Photography News, and we are recording this a little earlier than normal because I'm about to go off on holiday for a couple of weeks. And, well, I think it's safe to say it's the hottest day of the year. So I'm looking at two people who are not wearing very much to record this podcast. So let me first of all introduce, I think he's just about got a pair of shorts on, contributing editor Mr. Kingsley Singleton.
Hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, we're fine, Kingsley. If you could just pop a shirt on, that'd be
This reminds me of one of the great phrases of Northern England, which is mafting.
Mafting?
Mafting to describe hot weather or, close weather, I believe. That's east, northeast? I don't know. Someone write in and let us know.
So we're all mafting at the moment.
Yeah.
And alongside Kingsley, and has just put a shirt on, especially for the podcast, so he looks all nice and smart, Mr. Photography himself and the editor of Photography News, Will Chung.
How are we doing, guys?
So, following on from the last podcast, which was the special one with Charlie Waite, we're getting back to a sort of more normal service. If you haven't listened to the Charlie Waite podcast, please do so. There's some absolute photographic gems in there, and we've had a great response to Charlie's, to Will's interview with Charlie. But what we're going to do, like I say, back to a more normal service, and so we're going to kick off by talking about what we've been photographing. So, Will, why don't you go first? What have you been up to over the last few days and weeks?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to have a new camera to try, which is a Fujifilm X-T200. So I have an excuse to go out and take pictures. And also this time of year, it's great for poppies. If you can find the little things, it's a wonderful time of year to do some landscape with poppies. Now, obviously, you have to be a little careful with lockdown and everything, but I've been driving around locally, found very little. It seems, I don't know if there's not much of a crop this year or whether it's late, but speaking here in late June, I haven't had much success with poppies. But once I find some, I'll be all over them.
So there is no kind of logic, is there, to where poppy fields grow? They seem to be there one year and then disappeared the next.
Yeah, as I gather, I mean, obviously farmers spraying and everything else that affects them. But even poppies on the roadside can be really photogenic. I mean, doing close-ups or single shots or some out of focus stuff or some deliberate camera movement. So even a few poppies can make for a photo opportunity. But even a few, I've struggled to find this year, at least in this area.
Yeah, I think I've only seen one small field, but fairly modest in number and not particularly the sort of real carpet of red that you want to see. We should probably start some sort of poppy field register, shouldn't we, on the website that enables people to let us know we can have hot spots around the country where the poppy fields are. Kingsley, you had any luck with poppies, or are you shooting something else?
I did see some locally, and now I can't remember where they were, but that actually brings me on to what I have been doing, which is a bit like not actual photography, but a bit more photographic planning in a way. I've been taking a bit of my own advice that we had last time, which is about looking at your local town and trying to find new views of it and stuff like that. So I've been doing a bit of walking and just using my phone to kind of to grab shots of certain scenes and certain angles that I kind of want to come back to when the light is right or the time of year is right. And I've also ended up, I've sort of printed out a map of town and I've started marking off little bits on it to kind of, so that I don't forget these things like the poppy field that I did forget. So yeah, just more of a bit of planning. And I'm hoping that some of these pictures might turn into a kind of seasonal projects, where you go back to particular places in different seasonal, to give them different seasonal looks, so in autumn, snowy, winter, rain, probably a lot of rain. And I mean, and there are certain challenges to that, which are to find somewhere that I suppose that you have to think ahead, don't you? You have to look at kind of where the tree growth is going to be and whether they're going to be obscuring certain things, and also you have to work out whether you don't want to pick a place that is suddenly going to be covered in cars parked in the summer or something like that. So there's a bit of thinking ahead and a bit of planning.
Okay, that sounds good. And have you? I mean, you say you're looking around your locality. In terms of that, how do you sort of look at it in a new way? Because if you've lived somewhere and you've lived where you've lived for some years now, how do you go around looking through new eyes to sort of see new opportunities?
Yeah, I think you can look at it two ways. You can either sort of force the issue by kind of like one of the well-worn pieces of photographic advice is to take a prime lens out with you, isn't it? And just force yourself to see differently. And that actually literally does start to change the way that you view stuff, and you start to think in those focal lengths, and as it is really, really useful. But then at the same time, I think just as you just kind of go through life, you end up thinking differently and noticing different things anyway. I mean, so like I've said on several of these, I'm quite interested in kind of longer lens landscapes and longer lens views of town now. So that's what I look for. I've actually got to the point where I know, for instance, that the 300 mil, I think this is about right, the 300 mil on my Nikon full frame, I know is about, if I hold out my thumb at arm's length, I know that is about a 300 mil framing. So I can look at something and kind of go, right, that'll work in that. It depends on the size of your thumb
if you can,
and the length of your arm.
You can see us now. We're all on a video call. We're all just holding our arms. I'm not sure I could get very much in that. Is that right? That's a nice rule of thumb. Is that where the term rule of thumb comes from?
I don't know actually. That's another thing that people can write in and tell us.
Absolutely.
Or we could just Google it.
Yeah, we could just Google it. That's absolutely true. Because I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? We've all got places that we like to go back to and photograph time and time again. And I know, Will, that's one of your things, isn't it? Sort of revisiting places. But in terms of, I mean, how do you, Will, look at kind of seeing things in a different way when it's a place that you're familiar with?
Well, time of day is often one key thing. I mean, I've been doing a project on the Docklands Light Railway in East London, and I've been down there for, get there for mid-morning and shoot through to the afternoon. So I've got a whole bunch of pictures there. But, now that lockdown's free, I intend to go down for late afternoon and shoot into the evening.
Right.
So for me, that'd be obviously a very simple thing, just a time of day. And this time of year is wonderful, isn't it? Because it's get twilight, even at 10 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
It's awesome. It's a lovely time of year. Yeah. So, for me, it's just a time of day thing. And the Kingsley thing about different lenses, I think that's a good idea. I do know photographers who use, old slide mounts, for instance, to view their picture. They look through it. You think, I'll frame it like this or frame it like that. And you move it backwards and forwards to give them an idea how it looks with different lenses.
Oh, right.
So you can just make a mask to suit, whether you shoot micro four thirds or 35mm or APS-C format. You can just use a card mask and have it in your bag and just walk around with this thing going, oh, that's how I want to frame it.
I think that the other thing that you can do as well is start to look at kind of how you position the subject in the frame and what other elements you use. And one of the things I've started doing recently is trying to frame pieces of architecture, sort of either through trees or through other pieces of architecture to try and get like a different view, to sort of to kind of push it forward a little bit. And and particularly when you're shooting with longer lenses, you can kind of blur this stuff out more easily and create these kind of framing effects.
Yeah. Top advice. Well, unlike you,
someone falling over there.
Sounds like, I think Will's chair's on its.
Sorry, my chair's creaking.
Well, as this is a photography podcast, and you, by the sounds of it, haven't really been doing a great deal of photography, the good news is that more recently I have, and I followed up on a promise that I made to myself on a previous podcast where I was missing my family during lockdown, and I sort of resolved to make sure that. When I got to see them again, I'd be sure to take some pictures. And so I was delighted to have a visit from our 6-month-old granddaughter, with parent in tow, obviously, a few weeks ago, and when the lockdown had eased. And I took the opportunity to dig out a GFX 50S, which I actually had as a lone camera with a 110mm lens on it, and took a few pictures of her. And it was a really sort of... Just to look at the pictures now, they're largely snaps. Just photographed her indoors in nice soft light. But that camera lens combination is absolutely cracking for that sort of stuff. And now we've got some pictures which are now adorning the home screens of most of the family's phones, it appears.
Did you? Well, actually, that's the ultimate accolade in modern photography. I was counting them up the other day, and I think I've managed to bag about 6 or 7 people's home screens. So I'm like, I'm all over that. But I was going to say, did you make use of the IAF, or my knowledge of babies is just ridiculously limited, and I was pulled up on this by my wife because I thought that children's eyes didn't open for some time after they were born, and I was actually confusing that with puppies, which I know a lot more about.
Right.
But I'm assuming that the IAF came into play, did it, or the face AF kind of thing?
The face detection AF certainly came into play, and it's interesting because actually it does sort of key in a little bit to some of the other stuff we've been talking about on these podcasts, and it's like it is about using the facilities on your camera that help you take better pictures. And I think ordinarily I probably wouldn't have used face detection AF because I might have been slightly wary of its capabilities, or actually just wanted to stick with what I know, which is, single point AF, normally in the middle of the frame, as I think Will has accused me of doing in previous podcasts. So yeah, I dived in, used the face detection AF, and the hit rate was very good. I mean, she was quite a sort of fast-moving little thing, bobbing to one side and what have you. But yeah, it did pretty well. And the pictures, yeah, I'm really pleased with.
And so like a sort of a career in baby photography beckons, or you're one of these crazy like posing tables or these weird socks that people put.
Well, interestingly enough, my daughter-in-law has actually informed me that they want to do a cake smash party for her first birthday. I don't know if you're familiar with what this thing is, but
Sadly,
basically
yes.
they buy a big cake and then leave the child to smash it to bits, which seems like a bit of a waste of money from my perspective. But as long as I've got a camera and face detection AF, then we should be home free.
I might do that with my dog photography, I think.
What's the equivalent of a dog cake smash?
I don't know. You make it out of pedigree chum.
Yeah. So we thought we'd have a little chat about lenses. There's an article in the next issue of Photography News. Which issue is it, Will?
Issue 78. It's out now. Issue
78 out now. You can read it online at photographynews.co.uk. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about lenses, and specifically. Well, two things really. First of all, what about our favourite lenses, gentlemen?
So we're talking about the lenses that were really important to us, aren't we? And I guess like some of the lenses, my favourite lenses are the ones I've got now. But when we started thinking about this, I kind of was dragged a little bit back to when, like, I suppose to the late noughties, where I was first starting to spend proper money on cameras and kind of get into it. And that reminded me of, I had a Sigma 18 to 50 f2.8 on, which I used on a Nikon D200 or 300, I think. Maybe that's a bit too early for 300, I don't know. But anyway, that was kind of quite a sort of, when you're going from variable aperture standard zooms to something that's fast, it's quite an eye-opener, and I just remember being very impressed by it because it would give you a lot of options, both to do kind of low light, wide angle photography, longer stuff, decent portraits. That was quite an influential thing, and I seem to remember it was affordable. It was just, it made a big impact on me, clearly.
And did you embrace the fact that it made you lazier as well, because you could just twist the zoom barrel and not have to walk anywhere?
See, I don't think, like, although I first learnt photography using like a film camera and a 50mm. I think when I went digital, I always just had 18 to 55, 3.5 to 5.6 type lenses. So I think I was lazy already.
So your cameras. So you're saying the late noughties when you were starting to spend proper money on stuff. So you were definitely a child of the zoom kit lens then, weren't you?
I mean, that is an interesting distinction, isn't it? Because I'll open the door to old father time of photography, Will Chung here, but zoom lenses were quite an extravagant and rare thing up to a certain point, weren't they? We're talking the kind of early 80s or the
old father time, cheeky monkey. The thing is about zooms, I mean, I'm a prime lens man. Prime lens being a fixed focal length. So when zooms started coming out, I mean, they were coming out in the 70s. I remember Vivitar Series 1, for instance. I wasn't on magazines then, so I didn't get to try one. But when zooms started coming out, I used to read all the reviews, and they always weren't that great. They're okay, but they weren't that great, especially wide open. So I personally stuck with primes until quite late on in my career. So I'm going back to prove how old I am. I am going back to the 70s for my favourite lens. Is when I bought my Canon FTBN actually, and I had a 50mm 1.8 lens on it. And I couldn't afford another lens for ages. And eventually I saved up enough to buy a lens which I saw advertised, because I think they were selling it off because it didn't work very well for them. And that was a Vivitar 35mm 1.9. And that's why I love 35mm lenses. So it's only slightly wider than 50mm, but it was a 1.9. And importantly at the time, it was about 30 quid, which I think is probably about a week's salary anyway, because I used to work in a warehouse. But that's a lens that changed my life. A 35mm 1.9 manual focus on my Canon, because it made that focal length my favourite, and it still is, to be fair. And that is going back a little bit.
So what lens?
I still love primes, by the way. I still prefer to use my feet. I'm not as lazy as Kingsley. I tend to use my feet, and I like working with a prime. But that said, of course I use zooms now. They are good. They are very, very good.
Exactly. I mean, just to prove Kingsley's laziness further, he's already said earlier that he uses a 300mm to shoot landscapes. That's just because he can't be bothered to get out of the car when he's.
This is because I also got an interest in astronomy. So I'm just used to looking at stuff from a long way away.
So, Will, what lenses did you have with the 35-1.9, or was that your sole lens?
Well, for ages when I had the Canon FT-BN, the 50mm and the Vivitar 35mm I just mentioned, I kept with those two lenses for quite a while. I just, you couldn't afford to buy lenses in those days in the same way. I think things in some ways things are much cheaper nowadays. And it was only much later on I ended up buying a 100mm 2.8 for portraits, and that took a while again, and that was a Canon-owned lens, and that was lovely too. I mean, that's the thing with lenses. When you think back and look at the pictures you've taken, I've got fond memories of lots of bits of glass.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously that's connected with the moment, but I remember using a Tacchina 300mm lens. I used to love that, and I used to have a fisheye. As photographers, we go through optics. And we go through phases and trends as well.
Absolutely. I think for me, it's interesting that you're sort of recalling days gone by, and we kind of all are doing in a way, because my favourite lenses are very much the ones that I had when I started taking pictures. And I started off, I think my lens sort of buying trajectory is very common for somebody who was like me, who was taking pictures in the late 80s when I really started. And I started off with like a 50mm 1.8, and then I bought a Tamron 70-210. Will, you'll remember, with the Adaptall 2 mount system on it,
good system.
Which was a fantastic system for those who don't know, where you could, if you had two different camera bodies or changed camera systems, all you had to do was change a mount, and the lens would continue to work on it. Which was a great system. Don't know why they got rid of it anyway. But then the thing, I think, if we're talking about lenses that changed how we took pictures, in a similar ilk to your 35, Will, mine was a Sigma 24mm f2.8, and I was really into photographing landscapes at the time, and it was just the sort of, to go from a 50 and then a 70-210 to a 24 was like, wow, I can get loads in. And all that whole sort of thing about having to include foreground interest all of a sudden, and even shooting landscapes with the camera turned on its side and stuff like that. It just kind of it opened up.
What witchcraft is this?
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, very, very fond memories of that sort of first trio of lenses. And
so have you sort of integrated that into what you've got now? Do you just keep to those kind of prime lens, or do you kind of go for a zoom?
Well, I mean, as I've alluded to before on a podcast, which clearly shows that you're not listening, is that the only camera that I can call my own right now is a Fuji X100S, which has got a fixed 35mm lens. So I'm channeling my inner Will Chung and shooting with the equivalent of a 35mm. Although obviously you can also fit teleconverters and wide angle converters onto that as well. So I could, if I wished, I could get a 28mm and a 50mm as well. But
it's still one for the beret wearers, that though, I think.
But it does bring me on to the next question, which I was going to ask you, to sort of round off this lens idea, and that is that if you had to choose one type of lens, not focal length specifically, to see out your photographic days, what would it be, Will?
Oh, tough call. I still like the idea of keeping to a fixed focal length. But that said, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned it, but in my inbox just now has arrived a press release from Tamron lenses, and they just announced a new 28mm to 200mm super zoom. So that's 2.8 to 5.6. And I think as time goes on, the appeal of a lens which does everything actually has some appeal. I mean, I haven't tried this particular lens. It's brand new, obviously, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. But I like the idea of having a lens now which can cover much more than just maybe with a fixed focal length. And that's partly, it's not because I'm lazy like Kingsley, it's because I'm old. And I'm living up to the father time tag.
I'm old as well.
Just one lens for everything now has more appeal than it ever used to be fair.
Right, interesting. That could be framed as a bit of a cop-out, Will.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't care. I mean, as long as the pictures are good, the proof of the pudding and all that, that's what that matters.
So you're going for a super zoom. So Kingsley, presumably a 300mm, so you could shoot everything from your bedroom or your car.
No, I'd go. I mean, I'm interested in what Will's saying there, because I'd written down a few super zooms from the point of view that you often sort of look back through collections of pictures and you imagine that you only get good shots with really, with sort of primes and fast zooms and stuff like that. But a lot of the stuff that I'm sort of most fond of is stuff where I've kind of gone somewhere interesting and I've had like an 18 to 300 or something like that, and actually, used in the right way, in the right light, with the right settings and all that kind of stuff, you can get sort of great results out of stuff like that. But and that made me think of, not so long ago I reviewed the Sigma 60 to 600 for PN, and that was an awesome lens. I mean, it's absolutely huge, so I probably wouldn't go for that one because it's quite something to lug about, but the versatility of it was quite incredible. But what I'm actually going to settle on is a 70 to 200 f2.8, because going through most of the pictures that I take, which is a lot of kind of dog pictures and stuff like that, so like a mix of portrait and kind of action things, and also you can use a lens like that for kind of closer cropped landscapes and general photography. I'll go for that. I'll go for my Nikon 70 to 200 f2.8.
So a telezoom, so a super zoom, a telezoom. Well,
come on, Rod.
No zooms. No. You've got to be more. You've got to be more disciplined than that.
So you'll be going for a 10mm fisheye.
Eight actually, or if you, I'm trying to remember it now. Will, was there a 6mm Nikon fisheye? Was there? Do you remember, it had a massive barrel like
the 2.8. I know that's an amazing lens. It costs thousands, isn't it? And I think one sold for lots of money fairly recently because he found one in very good nick.
I was going to say it regularly, or not regularly, it occasionally appears on eBay and goes for fabulous cash.
Yeah. And is that the one that you could actually see behind you? So it's got a 220
degrees view. It was amazing.
Well, anyway, I wouldn't have that. What I would have, because I have given this some thought and thinking about what I like to photograph, I'd actually choose a macro lens. And the reason why I'd choose a macro lens, something like a sort of 80mm, 90mm macro lens, something like that, is because you can focus nice and close with it, so you could do lots of macro-y stuff. But in most cases, a macro lens has got a fast aperture, f2.8, something like that, and it also doubles really nicely as like a good portrait lens. I could do a modest amount of walking and do some longer lens landscape photography with it. So I think actually a macro lens is really quite versatile. So while you boys are zooming backwards and forwards, I'll be paying closer attention to the details and shooting macro stuff, I think.
We should have set this up as a kind of a desert island lens thing, shouldn't we? Where you'd be sort of thinking, well, what are you going to photograph with your macro lens on a desert island? The edge of palm tree leaves.
There's so much, Kingsley. It depends on what sort of desert island are we talking about? Is it just the standard mound of sorts?
Yeah, it's one from a cartoon.
Yeah.
There is a feature there, though, isn't there, on the desert island theme? We're about 8 photographic items you would pick.
Let's get Charlie back
for this podcast, but for a future one, we should do that. Maybe ask all our listeners to get involved too.
That is a lovely idea. So so the next podcast we will do our desert island gadget bags.
Yes. Great idea.
So 8. So what's the rule? So 8 products that you would take. The one thing you would save if the sea got high.
Yeah.
And some maybe one random non-photographic thing that you'd take along as well.
Yeah, that's a luxury, isn't it?
A non-photographic luxury.
Yeah, we get Shakespeare in the Bible.
Yeah, and that stuff as well.
Okay.
an old German car is not allowed as a luxury, Kingsley.
I was thinking you could use, if you got the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible, you could probably end up using that in place of a stepladder to change your angle of view for stuff, couldn't you? That might be quite handy.
Definitely could. Great stuff. And a nice idea, Will, to include listeners to send in as well. Please send us your desert island kits. And the best way to do that is to get in touch with us on our email address, which is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. You can also obviously go to the website, which we've already talked about, photographynews.co.uk, and there you will see all the latest news, technique articles, reviews, content from the magazine, and you can read the magazine digitally online there as well. So if you can't get to a camera shop or you don't have a subscription to the magazine, then you can read it digitally online for free. So go to photographynews.co.uk to do that. Some people who have contacted us at podcast@photographynews.co.uk have sent us some questions. So it's about the time of the podcast that we like to answer those questions. Now, the first one is actually more of an amalgam of a whole series of questions we've had about photographic software. We've had a number of people who've got in touch with us and said, I want to do raw processing and I'm currently using Lightroom, but is that the best software to use for raw processing? So Kingsley, why don't you start? Do you think that that's the obvious choice for people to raw process with?
I think there's a lot of choices now, so it's difficult to say there's an obvious one. As much as I really think Lightroom's got a massive amount to offer, but I think you've got to be quite deliberate in your intention to use it, because I've used it on and off over the years, but never really got into the whole idea of cataloging stuff and using it in that way. And so as a raw converter, it's fine, but really you're not making the most use of it in that way. And because I never really got into it in that way, I just tend to use Bridge and Photoshop's built-in camera raw interface.
Right.
and I do it all with that. I don't actually use Lightroom at all.
That's interesting.
Shocker.
It's it. No, what about you, Will?
I'm a Lightroom fan, and I do the cataloging thing. I mean, I don't do all the keywording, although I'm starting to do that a bit more. But I use Lightroom because it's, for me, very effective, because you can actually have literally thousands and thousands of pictures in the catalogue. And the thing works quite quickly, it previews quite quickly. And it just seems to work very effectively for what I do. So I use Lightroom. I agree with Kingsley, it's not the best raw processor. I think you get better performance if I did some tests recently with Capture One, which has changed. It's now version 20, I think it is now. And I also use DxO Photo Lab 3, and I found the noise reduction and the general processing of both those I found superior to Lightroom. But I still prefer to use Lightroom for most of my work because it's I've got all my catalogues in there.
I think one of the people that wrote in mentioned that they had been using Lightroom and were a bit worried about switching. And all I'd say about that is that switching isn't actually as complicated as you think, because most of these softwares do identical things using identically named sliders. And although some things might be in different places, if you sort of actually give yourself the time, and don't put too much pressure on yourself to learn everything at once, but give yourself the time to kind of navigate around it, you'll find that you're quite capable of switching over, although it seems like a big deal.
Yeah, I think the other thing I was just going to add in on that as well is that it's worth looking at, I guess, what the manufacturers perhaps recommend also, in terms of, obviously, some manufacturers you get software supplied as part of the package with your camera, but other manufacturers might have specific sort of recommendations, and it's always worth just either getting in touch with them or looking on forums or stuff like that. And as a Fujifilm user, for example, there is a free version of Capture One that Will's mentioned called Capture One Express Fujifilm, which I've played around with a little bit. I mean, I must admit I'm very invested in the Lightroom system because I've got all my stuff catalogued that way. But I have found that, and it backs up what Will says, that the Capture One system is good for Fujifilm users. So find out which ones your manufacturer recommends. So hopefully that sort of covers off that question for most people. And then we've got another one from a chap called Alan Aintree, or Alan in Aintree. I'm not quite sure which it is. He said, I liked your recent landscape special podcast with Charlie Waite, so much so that I listened to it twice. Thank you very much, Alan.
It is lockdown.
It's lockdown. It's clearly got a great deal to do. In light of Kingsley's misadventures that we heard about with tripods last time, my question is this: what is the most thrilling or dangerous time you've had when photographing landscapes? Well, let's not do Kingsley, because he's, after pushing the limits with licking his tripod last time round. Then we'll come back to him. What about you, Will?
To be fair, I haven't had much danger, as Alan mentioned, in terms of landscape, but I did have one interesting experience in an urban shoot once, and I remember specifically when it was, because I was on the Eurostar, and it was Super Saturday in 2012 when we won loads and loads of gold medals. Rutherford, Ennis, and Farrar won, I think. I was on the train at the time. Anyway, I went to Paris for an overnight shoot with some friends, and we were at the Arc de Triomphe. Now, I was on the outside of the Arc de Triomphe, and I'm sure many people know and have been there, but, loads of roads funnel into the Arc. I think there are 12 roads all getting into that area. And I was outside of the Arc. Now, obviously, to get to the inner part, you normally have to go through underneath the subway, because it's clearly too dangerous to go across the road with 12 roads funneling traffic into the Star. Anyway, there I was on the outside walking around with my friends, and I looked across to the centre, and I thought it was a stunning picture. And to be fair, it was so stunning I can't remember what it was. And I decided, because it was so stunning, that I just had to get this darn picture. And inspired by our colleagues in the Olympics, I ran across the darn road over X number of lanes of traffic, doing the, like you get in Hollywood films, ducking over traffic and sliding across people's bonnets. I ran across the road with my tripod and rucksack, got there safely. The picture obviously had gone, long gone. And as I was there getting my breath back, I looked up and 2 gendarmes turned up. And they clearly worked out I was British. And they just said, "Do you know how stupid that was, you doing what you were doing?" They gave me such a dressing down. They said, "You must use the subway next time." "Yes, sir." "No, sir." 2 bags full, sir. So that is my moment of danger, if you like. And they were just crossing the road.
Fantastic. Well, my example of danger, I guess, would be I was on a walking sort of journey, well, not walking trip, I suppose, many years ago with a friend of mine in the Peak District, and it was a sort of December, and it was very snowy up there, and we used to go up there and walk around, do a sort of a walk and take pictures as we went round. And I distinctly remember one time, probably with an old Olympus camera or something like that I had, walking towards a particular spot that I wanted to stand to take a photograph looking out over this valley, and disappearing virtually up to my chest in snow as I took one step forward. So I sort of walked along the path and then clearly had walked into an area where it was significantly steeper and deeper in snow. And I kind of stopped and looked around and thought, yeah, maybe it wasn't actually worth taking that picture. Similar to you, Will, the picture had gone. And there I was, chest deep in Peak District snow. So that's probably about the most dangerous thing I can account for when I've been shooting landscapes. But obviously, we've been waiting for the final pièce de résistance in this, Mr. Danger, the landscape tripod licker, Kingsley.
I suppose there's several incidents where I've fallen over or there was one incident where I accidentally walked into a small lake on the Isle of Skye, but the one that kind of
hang on a minute, just a minute before you move on. Accidentally walking into a lake.
Okay, well this was I'd gone out to do a sunset shoot, and I was walking back to the cottage where I was staying, and I had a head torch on. And what happened was I sort of came down a hillside and carried on down it. And when you're walking in the dark with a head torch on, you get that kind of circle of light, and you can't see much else around it. And I was sort of beginning to feel like this slightly Blair Witch kind of thing going on. You're out in the middle of nowhere on your own, and then all of a sudden I realised I was kind of about knee deep in water, and it was like a bog kind of thing. And then I thought, I've walked into a puddle. This is ridiculous. But then I started sinking further. I was imagining this kind of thing of like being found in millennia time perfectly preserved with a
Tilt
Jitso
down
tripod. But fortunately, so I carried on sinking and was starting to get a bit worried about it. But then fortunately, sort of remembered that what you're supposed to do in those situations is kind of not panic and kind of lean over to where you think the shallower stuff is and try and sort of crawl your way out, which is what I did. And as I say, yeah, I was killed. So I survived and I made it back, albeit I was covered in mud. The other one, the one that I was going to talk about was, see, most of the time these things happen because you're not being careful. And it's because you get that kind of, and like Will and you both described, you get that kind of photographer's joie de vivre, and you go for it. You stay out a bit longer, you push yourself a little bit further, you get a bit closer to the edge. And what I did was I was on Crete, and there was a local lighthouse that I wanted to go out and take pictures of. So we had a bit of food, had a bit of drink, and then I decided to walk up this hill out onto this headland. And because I had a bit of drink and was probably wearing unsuitable footwear, I managed to slip and fall down part of this, basically like a headland approaching about a 50-foot cliff over the water. So I fell and I smashed I smashed the filter that was on the end of the lens. And as I fell, this filter splintered and it went right up through my hand. So what I had to do was
this is not disappointing. This is not disappointing.
What I had to do was arrest my fall with a piece of glass in my hand, and then basically kind of bandage myself up with a lens cloth and go back to town to find my wife, who was still sitting but in the same nice, cute little Cretan kind of bar. And it's like, oh, what the bloody hell's happened to you? Covered in blood. But I did get quite a nice picture of this lighthouse.
Don't drink and photograph, kids.
And you know what? I carried on. Once I'd kind of stopped the bleeding, I carried on. I took some more pictures. I thought, I'm not going straight back. I'm not in imminent danger here.
You suffered for your art. But also, I seem to recall, Kingsley, from previous conversations, not on this podcast, so I hope I'm not breaking any confidences here, but didn't you go away with another photographer and push them off a mountain and dislocate their shoulder?
We won't speak of this. Actually, we're probably under some sort of NDA about that, I think.
I didn't quite anticipate it was going to go that way, but there you go. Kingsley is clearly Mr. Danger. So good stuff. Hope that answers your question. Yeah, if you've got any questions that you'd like to put to us, we're at podcast@photographynews.co.uk. So I'm in a little room and I'm getting quite hot, so we need to wind this down and finish. So we wouldn't finish a podcast without a Will's word of wisdom. So go on, Will, what have you got for the listeners this time?
Well, just a quickie. It's something that comes up quite regularly when I go around the camera clubs. It's about street shooting. A lot of people like the idea of street photography, but they're a bit conscious about using their camera in public. So my tip for this podcast is learn to shoot from the hip. And by that I don't literally mean shoot from the hip, but it means shooting without actually looking through the camera lens, which sounds a bit bizarre. But if you, for instance, have your camera hanging down over your neck, and learn how to frame a picture even though you're not looking through it. You set automatic exposure, you use a lens like a 28mm equivalent or 35mm equivalent, and you can actually get some really good pictures with autofocus, maybe use face detection, which you mentioned earlier in the podcast, and you get some great pictures just by pointing and grabbing shots. So it's shooting from the hip. And with a bit of practice, you can learn where to stand and frame quite precisely. So for those of you who are shy, now that the streets are going to start getting busy again, this form of photography will be available. Do street photography, learn to shoot from the hip.
Fantastic. And yes, at the time of recording, we're just coming to the end of June, but by the time this podcast comes out, it probably will be July, and things like the lockdown will have eased further. So yeah, hopefully plenty more street photo opportunities to come. Great stuff. Thanks, Will. Well, that just leaves us to wrap up, and hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hope you tune in next time for Desert Island Kits. I'm scribbling down ideas as we speak, but that just leaves me to say thank you very much to Mr. Danger Kingsley Singleton.
Thanks. I'm just off to A&E.
and to Mr. Photography Will Chung. Thanks, Will.
No problem. All the best, guys.
Cheers. We'll see you again next time. Well, as this is a photography podcast and you two haven't taken any pictures recently, the good news is that I have, and I've actually followed through on something that I shouldn't have said. Sorry, followed through. Oh, yeah. Oh dear, I don't know why I think of myself so much.
You've been reading too much Viz.
Oh God.